Hi, you guys. Welcome back to another edition of History Tea with Professor T. I'm Professor T, and that stands for Professor Tracy Daniel. And in this edition, we will be discussing chapter 24 in your text, which has to do with the 1950s. So, chapter 24 is titled An Affluent Society. I really like learning about this time in American history because it really one, it forces us to take a deep look at ourselves as a nation. It's also during a time where most Americans by this time will have a television set. So things that are associated with the 1950s, such as the civil rights movement, well, now all of this will be broadcast on TV, right? We are a consumer culture in the 1950s, and we're also still fighting communism or the threat of communism spreading at this time. And so I really, really like learning about the 1950s. I love teaching about the 1950s. And so let's get started. Okay. So the 1950s, or during this period, we get I would say, a pretty rapidly changing economy. The 1950s are the last decade of the industrial age in the United States. We have fewer people working in factories at this time and more people who are working in clerical positions or professional positions. Clerical workers will rise by about 25% in the 1950s, and salaried employees will rise by about 60% in the 1960s or 1950s, excuse me. We also have an increase in agricultural production throughout this decade because there is more efficient machinery. This decade is also characterized by movement of people from cities to the suburbs. So after World War II, the soldiers have come home and baby, they are making babies, okay? And so the post war baby boom will really fuel this shift of people moving from the city to the suburbs. And all of this suburban, I would say, movement or suburbanization will create a demand for housing and TVs and home appliances and cars, for example. And after these soldiers have returned from World War II, part of their GI benefits is being able to get government backed low interest mortgage loans. And so you'll have really an entire generation of mostly white soldiers, but an entire generation of soldiers soldiers who are able to benefit from the GI Bill. They're able to get government backed low interest loans, and they're able to purchase homes in suburbs such as Levittown. So, Levittown was a suburb that was developed by William and Alfred Levitt, and the houses were relatively inexpensive. And part of the reason for this is that they were assembled pretty quickly from prefabricated parts. And so you were able to put up homes relatively quickly, and it made the homes relatively inexpensive. And so in Levittown, there were approximately, or I would say more than 10,000 homes, and it became home to about 40,000 people. Now, it's at this time in America in the 1950s that we will experience widespread consumerism, and all the things that we're buying, that we're able to buy, that we have the freedom to buy, is supposed to demonstrate the superiority of American life over communism. And there will be other ways that the American way of life being superior will be demonstrated. But one of these ways, I would say one of the first ways, is through consumerism. So at this time, there are low interest rates, and with the advent of credit cards, Americans are really at this point encouraged to they're encouraged to borrow money to purchase goods through the use of credit cards. And Americans are becoming more comfortable living in a certain amount of debt. Another way that the American way of life was transmitted really across the nation, another way that the American way of life was supposed to demonstrate our superiority over communism was through television. So television transmitted this middle class life, or this image of middle class life across the country. And so one of the shows I really like to use as an example is Leave It to Beaver. Leave It to Beaver, there are two children. The mom is a stay-at-home mom. The father works. He is able to provide enough money that only one income is needed, and that his wife is able to stay at home and watch the kids, and they have a really comfortable way of life. The children have toys, they have really nice clothes, they have breakfast every morning, and they have dinner every evening. So it's this very comfortable middle class American way of life that is transmitted really all over the nation. And Leave It to Beaver isn't the only show that is created in the 1950s that will show this. Other shows are also created, but a lot of them will have like the same, or I would say a similar message, that of this American way of life, this middle class lifestyle. By the end of the 1950s, most families in the United States own a TV. And this is really significant because another thing that the 1950s is known for is the civil rights movement. And so um, by this time, people all over the nation will be able to see the marches going on in Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham, right? But I digress. Um, by the 1950s, TV will replace newspapers as the most common source of information. But again, a lot of these TV shows avoided controversy. They will really project a pretty bland image of middle class American life. So it will be a life that is kind of free from any type of real world conflict, right? It's also in the 1950s, and especially since people are moving from the cities to the suburbs, you'll also get this demand for cars. You'll get a more, I would say, call it a commuter culture. You live in the burbs, but you work in the city. And so by 1960, about 80% of American families owned at least one car. Um, Auto manufacturers and oil companies were at the top ranks of corporate America at this time. And the car really transformed American life. It transformed daily life. It led to the construction of other things. So prior to there being lots of cars, there was really no need for motels, because where were you traveling to, right? So the car being so, I'll say, so common, led to the construction of hotels, and it led to the drive-in movie theater and roadside restaurants, because more and more people are hitting the open road and they're traveling. And so the car really helps to really, I would say, transform the idea of American freedom. And American freedom for so many people becomes something that's much more individual. It's the freedom of having individual mobility, being able to hit the open road, being able to have private choice. Now, what about women at this time? Because if you're watching Leave It to Beaver, you're seeing that a lot of women do not work, they stay at home. So, what's going on with family life and with women in the 1950s? So, the modern woman, some women worked in the 1950s to help to support their middle class lifestyle. However, for the suburban family, the breadwinner was the husband. The breadwinner is the male, and the wife remained at home. But there is, remember, a certain privilege of this, right? So if you are middle class, if you're upper middle class or upper class, more than likely the wife stays at home. If you are part of the lower economic classes, that's not a privilege that these women had. Okay. If you are part of the lower economic classes, it's important that the woman work because it's necessary for the survival of the family. Now, however, this idea of, or the ability of women being able to stay at home was also supposed to be one of those things that separated the United States from communism, right? That um, women don't have to work because one person makes enough money to support the entire family. And so that was supposed to separate the United States from the from communism, right? This baby boom, or boomers as we call them, people who were born in the 50s, it will last. This baby boom will last into the 60s. So those okay boomer memes are for people who were born in the 50s and the 60s. Okay. Now, while the 1950s is known as, yes, it's the last industrial age, and it's an age of consumerism and people buying homes and appliances and cars and things like this. The 1950s presents a very segregated America. Suburbs, in and of themselves, had very rigid racial boundaries. So the 1950s, even though if you were to watch Leave It to Beaver, it looks very I'll say content, the 1950s really still offered a very segregated landscape. So, suburbs, in and of themselves, had very rigid racial boundaries. In many of these suburbs, they had rules called covenants that barred the selling of homes to non white individuals. And federal agencies as well ensured mortgages that barred the sale of homes to non whites as well as the resale of homes to non whites. Um, Banks, private developers, all of these entities also barred non whites from suburbs. And a suburb that we've already talked about, Levittown, for example, refused to allow Blacks, including veterans, to either rent or purchase homes. And so while the suburbs, we look at that, they were still very segregated and very, I would say, they really made up a very, these neighborhoods are very homogenous, that they were mostly, if not all, white, because many of the covenants barred the sale of homes and resale of homes to non white people. And the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, would also not insure mortgages to people who lived in, well, we'll get to that in about two slides. So stay with me. In 1949, something called the Housing Act was passed, and the Housing Act authorized the construction of more than 800,000 units of public housing. It's in the 1950s that the landscape of the United States goes through, or I would say cities in the United States, goes through a process of what we will call in this course urban renewal. Urban renewal is where cities would demolish poor neighborhoods where people lived to build retail centers and to build middle class housing. And so in the United States during this time, it really becomes even more segregated, where in the inner cities is where you have black and brown and immigrants live, and it's in the suburbs where white people will live. Housing projects, for example, were banned in white and suburban neighborhoods, so you wouldn't even see a housing project in the suburbs. Now, it's at this time also that we have a policy, I'll call it, in the United States called redlining. And so if you're following along on your PowerPoint, you'll see that for the background of this slide, I have a map. And on this map, you have blocks of red and yellow and green and blue. Redlining maps were maps where these basically the FHA would look at certain neighborhoods and they would refuse a loan or refuse a mortgage to someone based on the neighborhood that they lived in because they deemed the neighborhood to be a financial risk. Now, how did they deem these neighborhoods to be a financial risk? If you were Black, those were called redlined neighborhoods. Those are the areas on the map that are in red. And so if you lived in a Black neighborhood, you were assumed to be a financial risk, which is why during this period, Black veterans, even though according to the GI Bill they were supposed to be eligible for low interest mortgage loans, this is why you don't see Black people moving into Levittown, for example, because even veterans were not able to get homes, because if they lived in a Black neighborhood they were seen as being a financial risk. And so each color, it went from like, red being high financial risk, yellow is if you were poor, if you lived in an immigrant area, you were also deemed to be a risk. Green was like, okay, blue was the best. And so that is what redlining is. And the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, institutionalized a system of discriminatory lending in government backed mortgages by using these maps. Now, I'm located in Houston, and if you are following along, if you are in my course this semester, I also included a redlining map of the city of Houston. And so you're able to see that this wasn't something that just happened in San Francisco and Baltimore, because those usually are the redlining maps that are used really whenever you see something on like television or a program. Many cities had their own redlining maps. And so you'll see, I even included a redlining map to Houston, or of Houston, to show that redlining was everywhere. It is American. It is very, very American. And it's really suburbanization that will harden racial lines of division in American life. So much so, between 1950 and 1970, about 7 million whites will leave the cities for the suburbs. This is sometimes called white flight. You will flee the suburbs or flee the cities for the suburbs. It's also during this time, excuse me, that about 3 million Black individuals will move from the South to the North, and this will increase the size of existing ghettos. Now, what about other tactics of housing segregation? Was there any fear, or were any fear tactics used? The answer to that is yes, and that is called block busting. Block busting was a tactic of residential segregation where real estate brokers would circulate exaggerated warnings of to white homeowners about the influx of Black people moving into the neighborhood, or the influx of brown people or other people deemed undesirable moving into the neighborhood, in order to get these people to quickly sell their homes. Okay, so even real estate brokers were in on it. If they wanted, look, we need to sell these houses quickly. So hey, there are a bunch of Black people moving into the neighborhood. Okay. So this will conclude part one. I'll come back with part two, and we will refocus on, I will say, the United States and communism and what we're doing to fight or contain communism. So, see you in a bit.